Welcome to Just Wanna Quilt, a research podcast coming out of Tulane University Law School, where we explore all kinds of things, stories about quilting, tools, field trips, maybe some famous quilters stop by, and, of course, a little bit of copyright thrown in just for fun. This is Elizabeth Townsend Guard, your host, and I'm a law professor at Tulane University Law School and a faculty fellow at the A.B. Friedman School of Business at Tulane. And I just want to quilt. So today we talk to children's author Susan Goldman Rubin, who wrote a book about Gee's Bend. So we had to have her on. I'm good. How are you doing?
Well, fine. I am so touched and honored and delighted that you invited me for this interview.
I'm so excited that you're here. This is mutual. This is so great. Well, I'm going to ask you a really official question in just a second, but I found your book because I went to my local library and I looked up quilts, and there your book was. So everybody can check it out and get it, and I just thought it was such a great book to have, and I loved it and read it cover to cover, and I just wanted to have you talk about the book, and your life, and all the things that you do and all that stuff. So.
Thank you so much. As you know, the title of the book is The Quilt of Gee's Bend, and I'm so amused that you invited me for a show called Just Want to Quilt, because I've never wanted to quilt.
So there you go. All right. Well, I think that's funny, too. Well, your book is great. We're going to start with a very official question, which is, I already know the answer, but tell me your name and where you're calling from.
Okay, my name is Susan Goldman Rubin, and I'm calling from Malibu, California. Oh. But remember, I'm a girl from the Bronx. so this is quite a leap cross country. I grew up in New York City, and I was an art student there. And because of marriages, I wound up in California and ultimately in Malibu.
Awesome. Well, we have a lot to talk about.
Good, great.
The first question I have for you is, do you have any memory of anyone sewing or quilting in your life? It's a question we ask everybody.
I do, and I loved listening to Laura Bickford's interview with you, and I knew that would be a question.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for asking it, because, I'm first generation. I only had one grandmother. She spoke Yiddish. I never saw a quilt in the Bronx, never.
Yeah.
But what I do remember, thank you for asking, is my mother darning socks, and she would put this, and I never thought I was poor, but I remember her darning socks, putting the sock over the end of a water glass, what we used to, the kind of glass she would serve orange juice in.
Yeah.
And I remember her using a thimble, which just fascinated me as a little girl. I didn't understand how that worked. And I remember her biting the thread off when she was done doing her stitching.
Interesting.
So I was so moved by that memory. Thank you for asking.
Yeah.
But and then another memory came. I was homesick a lot. This was during the years of World War II, and after, when antibiotics were not yet available for civilians. And I had to stay home in bed, to be isolated from, very serious ear infections. And one time my mother gave me the privilege of sewing my own blanket. In other words, I had this kind of rough blanket, and my mother gave me needle and thread and allowed me to stitch it.
That's really cool.
And I was thrilled, and thank you for just summoning up that memory, because I had totally forgotten.
So interesting, isn't it? Some people don't have memories, but it does take you back to a very different time. And I don't know, I like that question, because it kind of gives us a plain, like where we're starting from. So,
absolutely. And in fact, being in the Bronx, I went to junior high and public school, and one of the classes was a sewing class. And we used sewing machines, which was phenomenal. And I still remember the apron I made, and I perfectly remember the pattern of fabric, because I saw some of that fabric in the quilts of Gee's Bend. Thank you for these great questions.
It's very cool. I love it. Well, what's so cool about you and what I really was excited about was that you are you write for kids, right? Most of your stuff is for kids. And as a kid, I would have read every single thing that you've written because I loved historical nonfiction as a kid. I loved it. It made me feel like I could get into those worlds, and I just loved it. And you've written you've written a lot of books, and
thank you.
Really cool titles, right? And lots of different topics. So the first question I had before we get into the G's Bend is, how do you choose your topics? And what draws you to something? Tell me a little bit about sort of how you got here and how you choose the topics that you write on.
That's a wonderful question. Well, I started as an artist. I always wanted to be an artist, and I always wanted to illustrate children's books. And when I was 10 years old, my mother, who was very protective, allowed me to ride the subway myself down to the Art Students League in New York. And I took my first art class. And then I went to the High School of Music and Art, which was a great privilege. You know, New York has these wonderful public schools. And at the time we took tests, to get into them. And it wasn't that I was a very qualified artist, but when they saw potential, they let kids in. I learned that later. And it was a great experience. So I really expected to be a children's book illustrator. And I had it all figured out. I was going to get married, have 5 children, and do this work nicely at home.
Yeah.
I had no idea what it took to make a book or to raise a child, much less a few. That was a surprise. And my parents didn't want me to major in art at college. I went to Oberlin, which is a wonderful liberal arts school, and they thought I was too good a student, to bother with art. As smart as they were, golly, can't imagine it. Anyway, I took art classes anyway and majored in English. But as I quickly got married and thought I knew what it was to illustrate a book, which I really didn't, I wound up living in a suburb of Los Angeles, couldn't afford to go to New York and show my portfolio. So I started writing little stories based on family incidents just to do what is called a dummy, to show that I understood that a picture book would be a sequence of pictures rather than just one beautiful piece of art. And to my surprise, I received more interest from editors in my writing than in my art.
Amazing.
But I did go on to illustrate my first 3 picture books. It took 5 years to get there. But meanwhile, I was trying to develop my abilities as a writer, and no small trick when you're really raising a family of children.
Yeah.
I already had 3. So during this period, I kept drawing, but I really didn't know how to make a picture book. I had to learn on the job, and I kept taking writing classes at UCLA in the writers program, where I eventually was a teacher, because I knew I needed to build up my abilities as a writer. So I've been at it for years, and along the way I got divorced, remarried. I've been married to my second husband for more than 40 years.
Wow.
And we decided to have yet another child. I already had 3. He had 2. That gave me the 5. So here comes number 6. And I couldn't really do the artwork. And meanwhile, I was painting and showing my work as an artist in galleries. And the artists, wonderful artists I studied with here in LA, said, don't bother with children's books. Just paint. But I just loved the idea of doing books for children. It just seemed my calling. I always loved the idea. I'm Jewish, but I love the idea of having a calling.
Right.
And that seemed to be it. So when I couldn't really actively do the art, one of my friends suggested that I write a novel, which I did, and it led to writing nonfiction. And I'm so glad you mentioned your interest, because in those days, a lot of the nonfiction was so whitewashed and so boring.
Yeah.
And my youngest son, who's now almost 38, loved a book called How to Wreck a Building. I still remember the title because I read it to him morning, noon, and night. And it was a great nonfiction photographs as illustrations. He adored it. And I realized that you could really put your own passionate interest into a nonfiction book. And I belong to a marvelous organization now called SCBWI, which is Society of Children's Book Writers and now Illustrators. But when I started going to those meetings and realized there were other people in Southern California who wanted to do children's books as much as I did, one of my dear friends, to whom Quilts of G's Bend is dedicated, by the way, Ann Whitford Paul, would always bring some quilts that she was stitching. She was always doing some kind of beautiful sewing work, stitching, or needlepoint. And we went to a lecture on nonfiction by a guy who was doing books on motorcycles, something like that. And we looked at each other and thought, oh, we don't have a hope, because what do we care about? She said, I love stitching. And I said, I love art. How are we going to compete with this? And then I thought, wait a minute, I could write about art because that's what I love so much. And I want kids to enjoy the art that I love. And that's how I got started. And my first nonfiction book was a biography of Frank Lloyd Wright. And here I had stepkids and my own kids, and we have Hollyhock House here in Los Angeles, a Frank Lloyd Wright building.
Uh-huh.
And one time my husband and I would always think of cheap, totally free outings to do with the kids on the weekend. We had no money with all these kids.
Right.
So we said, okay, we're taking you to see Hollyhock House by a very famous architect named Frank Lloyd Wright. And my stepson said, Frank Lloyd who? And I thought, okay.
There you go,
okay,
right?
That's it.
I love it.
And that got me started. And when I looked at what was out there, when you do a book, you always have to check and see what's already out there.
Right.
And the big problem is trying to come up with something fresh, a subject that has not been written about. Yeah. On the other hand, you have to convince an editor that will still be popular and of interest.
Right.
I didn't want to do another book on Abraham Lincoln or Benjamin Franklin,
right.
Or Mary Cassatt. I wanted to do a book about someone who had not been written about as much. So that's how I got started publishing with Abrams. And I think one of my other books, my first nonfiction book, was, I published my first novel with a wonderful editor, and she had her own imprint at Harcourt Brace. And I love design, and I when I was at art school, at High School of Music and Art, one of my best friends had the daring to paint her bedroom black. Whoa! Oh, this girl has nerve.
Right.
In our apartment, you had a choice of pink or blue by the landlord.
Uh-huh.
I said black. And as art students in New York, oh my God, we all wore black.
Right.
Was there any other color?
No.
So, and I looked around and I thought, why are certain items, like in a classroom, a certain color? Do they have to be? Who makes that decision? So I thought that's what I wanted to write about. And I started thinking about all the rooms of the house. This for kids. Why not think about it? So I was going to call the book Toasters, Toilets, and Telephones, the How and Why of Everyday Objects. And my wonderful, wonderful longtime agent and mentor said, are you crazy? Start with toilets, because that's what kids really care about. Of course.
Right.
So the title was Toilets, Toasters, and Telephones, the How and Why of Everyday Objects. And that book was around for a long, long time. And it was so interesting, to really see how these items, that we're all familiar with, are designed. So that's how I got started. In other words, to get back to your question, I go with what interests me and the question I have. So if there's a certain piece of art that I love, who painted it and what's the story behind it?
Very cool.
And so that's how I tend to choose my own subject. Sometimes I'm invited. Like one time, there was an exhibit at the Chicago Art Institute, and I was thrilled that my Abrams editor asked me to join the curators, and they were going to do a project on the 8 crazy weeks that Van Gogh and Gauguin spent in the south of France. doing art together, and that's when Van Gogh, cut off his ear in a terrible argument they wound up having. And I went and listened, and they said, "Do you think there's a children's book here?" And I said, "Of course." This rivalry and being shut up, cabin fever in this little house. And the title came, The Yellow House. But often it's my own choice. I'll see something that's been overlooked and say, that's what I want to write about.
And then tell me your process on writing. So you get this idea, and then I would imagine that sometimes there's copyright, like you have to ask permission, or because sometimes you're writing about old people, old artists, sometimes new, sometimes historical, all kinds of things. So tell me a little bit about the process of writing, and sort of, do you worry about, like when you did a Andy Warhol book and all kinds of books. So tell me a little bit about that.
You hit the mark. You asked the best questions. I think I'll come to you for some consultation after this interview. Copyrights, oh, golly, the permissions. That's often the most difficult part of any project, and thank you so much for bringing that up, especially with Andy Warhol. And as a matter of fact, when I did the first Andy Warhol book with Abrams, the larger book, for what we'd call middle grade kids, there was very little attention being paid to Andy Warhol. And my editor at Abrams, I published with many different editors, but I've really done a great number of books with Abrams, which is just such a fine art book publisher. And when I said to my editor, I think kids would love this art, based on comics and, pop culture. I think kids would love it.
Yeah.
And he said, "Oh, let me see. Is there any exhibit coming up?" Because usually they like to tie in a book with an upcoming exhibit. And he hemmed and hawed and wasn't sure. And I said, "I really think kids would love it." And wouldn't you know that just when our book came out, there was an explosion of interest in Andy Warhol.
That's so interesting.
So at that time, fortunately for me, Abrams acquired the permission, and I did some wonderful research because I talked to some of Andy Warhol's old friends from his college days.
Oh, how cool.
Philip Pearlstein, who had come to New York with him, carrying their belongings in paper bags. And Philip Pearlstein is a wonderful figurative artist in New York. And I had the chance, the access to people who had not been interviewed so many times, because there just wasn't that much attention being paid to Andy Warhol then. So it was marvelous, and Abrams took care of the permissions. Then when I did a board book, do you know about those board books?
Yeah, tell us. I know, but tell in case people are listening. So you also did tell them about the board book.
Well, as I'm doing books for older children, meaning 8 to 12 or even 12 and up, not immediately, but then as I started getting grandchildren, little babies came along, and I thought, wait a minute, some of this art could be so enjoyable for these little ones. And a lot of the board books to me seem to have diagrammatic art, with big black outlines. And it was very, I don't know, I thought very dull compared to fine art.
Yeah.
And I thought, why not? Why couldn't there be, for instance, a board book of some of Andy Warhol's images? Because he did this very wonderful art, very whimsical art when he was just starting out as a young art director. And I remembered in the 50s seeing his illustrations for shoes for I. Miller, because at that time I was an art student, and also I was a teenager, and I wanted nothing more than to have a pair of heels from I. Miller. It was a combined passion.
Right.
And you don't forget those images.
Right.
So I thought little ones can certainly love these purple horses. And during the course of research for the Andy Warhol book with Abrams, I read and found out that he used to have coloring parties at an ice cream parlor in New York. It was very famous
cool.
on Madison Avenue. He would, as a gift for art directors, just so that he could get more work, he would bring out like many copies of his drawings of cats and give all his friends. They would sit around, they'd order ice creams, and he would give them different pages, like a coloring book. and tell them to color them in different colors. He'd bring marking pens. And he had 25 cats named Sam, and all different colors. And I thought, kids would love this.
Totally.
They would love it. So I got this wonderful idea, and then who to take it to. So I took it to another editor, Victoria Rock at Chronicle Books. And we had done some books for older children. And I had this idea, and she said, I like it. I really like it. They had already done a series of board books on more traditional art, the Impressionists. So this began a series of books called Modern Masters. And then came Permissions. And by the way, I loved you're talking about Janet Hicks at ARS.
Yeah.
With Laura Bickford. We have so many connections going here. But the next step was my job. Not at Abrams, I never had to do the permissions, but now my job was to get permission. So I had to go through ARS. Mm-hmm. And that was tough, but we worked it out. And, of course, the permission fee took my whole advance. But so what? I thought, I love these little books.
Yeah.
And then the next trick was coming up with a narrative after we obtained the permission.
So let me ask you a question. That's really important. And I think part of what started me on this journey was I was seeing scholars and others that didn't ask permission before they would start a project. And then at the end of the project, they'd go and say, oh, can I have permission? And they would say no, right? So do you find that you are clearing the rights or making sure you could do the subject matter before you start into the project?
I really do. I've learned that the hard way because a reputable publisher will not even want to touch the project.
Yeah.
And usually when you do, in nonfiction, as you may or may not know, you always start with a proposal. I get the passion and I'm excited and I make some contacts. But then even if my editor says, I think it's a great idea, send me a proposal. And I have to write up, my thoughts about the project, where the permissions would come from, even the costs, what the fees would be.
Yeah. Because
if it's just out of sight, it just may be impossible. And, in children's books, the advances are low. We're the stepchildren in publishing. But that's okay. I'm passionate about what I do. And our books usually have a long shelf life. It isn't like adult books or books for adults that can come and go in a flash, if they're not bestsellers.
Right.
This is usually, books for children are often what are called backlisted. So they stick around for a long, long time, which is wonderful.
That is great.
But even when I did a book on Leonard Bernstein called Music Was It, I started out by contacting his office and even had an interview with his kids.
Really?
That's so great. To talk about the arc of the book, what I would discuss in his life, to make sure I had their cooperation, because that opens the door.
Yeah.
So thank you for asking, because these are very important issues in doing art books.
Well, and you've written on so many cool topics that
thank you.
I want to read them all. I really, really enjoyed reading your book. It was so funny because I was like, I never grew up. I mean, I'm like, I still want to be like reading. Like this is because it was so clear. Because the thing that I thought was really great about the book was it told the story for real. It wasn't like watered down, and it was very clear, and it really treated the kid with respect. And that's what I really liked about it, because it really wasn't like anybody could read this book and they really would understand what G's Bend was. And I really just loved that about it, that these are books that if you don't know who Coco Chanel is, or you want to know more about Maya Lin, that this is good for grown-ups too. Like you're telling them enough that they can really understand what this is. And I thought that was just really cool.
Thank you so much. And one of the great compliments I get, compliments are from adults who find that my books are more accessible when they want to know something about a subject, rather than a huge coffee table book, which is full of jargon, and it's never writing down. I think I'm frozen at age 11. I thought that was a wonderful age. And, when I was 11, I thought I really kind of knew everything.
Yeah.
And I had a much older brother who said, you can read anything you want. You don't have to wait for people to tell you. You can go to the library. And I started reading in the adult section of the library when I was a kid because I read everything in the children's section. In those days, they separated in our local library in the Bronx into two divisions, children's and adults, in literally two buildings.
Wow.
And they let me go, the privilege to the adults. So I'm never writing to it. I try to make it clear. I think of some of my grandchildren or my own kids, when they're 12, just to make it clear. And I also want to make it exciting. I want it to be a gripping read. I love stories. And to me, a good nonfiction book has to have the narrative of any piece of fiction. I want a story.
I want a story too. I really do. I mean, I think that's what drew me to books. They were like real stories. There was like, I don't know, something about like getting in the mind or the life of someone else seems just so fascinating at that age, Like, I don't know. So I would have read every single thing that you read. I would have been obsessed.
Thank you.
So,
well, I belong to this wonderful writers group that's been meeting, I think, for more than 40 years. And I'm a new kid because I joined them about 25 years ago. I'm so old I can't remember when I started. But we meet once a week, and other people read, your next proposal, your next chapter, so you hear it aloud. And I'm crazy about the subjects I write about. I'm passionate.
Yeah.
But a lot of my colleagues, although they're wonderful writers, don't know anything about this art or even care. I have to make them care.
Interesting.
And I can't get so caught up in my own obsession with the detail that I lose their interest.
I love it.
So that really helps me stay in line and know that I'm reaching the readership. They're my first readers.
Do you think that this writing group, because you are producing like 2 to 3 books a year, do you think that that's because of the writing group that you know that like every week you've got to be producing, or sort of like what role does the writing group and having a community, how does that impact on you as a writer?
You are so smart. It really does. There is the biggest thrill for me of the week. Don't let my husband hear this. I told him to go away while we had this interview. But the biggest thrill for me is when my group loves something I've brought in.
Yeah.
Or laughs where I didn't even know there was a laugh.
Yeah.
And that's in nonfiction too.
Yeah.
Or when they tear up and I thought, oh my goodness, I've really done it. And it is such an exciting moment that it just sustains me. So you're right, it does have an impact. And other groups, other friends of ours, who have, some people don't like to have so many voices weighing in. There are just a few of us now. But other people prefer solo work all the time.
Yeah.
But for me, it's a great incentive, really in a very selfish way, to get that kick, to get that thrill, or to hear, oh, no, you're way off base here. No.
I like
that. And that, I feel so despondent at first, and I take notes when they're discussing what I've done. And then when I go home, the next day, look at it with fresh eyes. I think, oh, yes, of course. And it really helps, and it helps keep the pace, as you say, the pace of the writing. On the other hand, I love being a critic. And that has informed my writing as well, because when you're trying, and I taught at UCLA for 20 years,
right.
Helping newcomers. But when you're working with published writers and saying, what does this need? No, this is really too much of this. It really informs your own writing.
Yeah, it really
enormously.
It's so interesting. My kid, who's 16, is doing a creative writing program at our local art school, and so they write 3 hours a day, and she does her regular classes, her academic classes, and she goes in the afternoon. And it's amazing to watch. Like I've seen, like she's always been a good writer, but like the last year, this concentration and having the feedback, and looking at different poetry and like the real serious study of it. It's just been remarkable to watch her growth and insight, and having a writing community seems to be really important to get that. It's just been really cool to watch.
Now, what are her goals? Is she a teenager? You're 16,
Yeah, she's
you
16. She's way into comic books and graphic novels because she loves art as well.
Oh, marvelous.
And she really loves... I don't know what I think she should do some more kid stuff, but she loves... She's the two things she's really into right now is LGBT stories and diversity stories, because she feels like there's not a lot out there that's like about her, like middle school kind of... Like, because the kids are coming out now in elementary school and middle school, so it's a very different kind of world. And then she's really into her Jewish identity stuff, so she's writing a ton of stuff. And we're kind of it's interesting because we've got very much like my mom was Jewish, I wasn't raised Jewish, my dad's Baptist, and she's very much about that sort of exploring identity stuff. I mean, she's 16, so everything's about identity. That's kind of what you're supposed to be doing at that point. But it's pushing her in really interesting directions. Because one of our neighbors here said, "Oh, I didn't know you were a little bit Jewish," and she thought, "Well, that's weird, right? Like, I don't know if you can be a little bit, right?" So, I mean, so it's gotten her to explore both of those topics. In her poetry and in her art, and now in a comic book that she's writing. So it's been really fun to sort of watch her, explore all of that. And it's been really interesting,
Does she know the musical was called Fun Home?
Yeah, she loves it. Yes.
I do too.
And loves it, yes.
The author-illustrator is an Oberlin grad.
Oh,
I went to Oberlin.
Interesting.
So she should take a look at that book. Because one of the songs is "I'm changing my major to Joan."
That's really great. Yes,
I love that song.
Is it Alison Becknell? Is that the author?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, like so influential. I think it was a teacher giving her that book in like 7th grade that sort of changed the trajectory of sort of what she wanted to be and she's been really serious about it. I mean, she's gone to a program in Chicago for a graphic novel and like at SAIC, and she's really she's serious about it. But it's fun to watch that sort of development. Now, I want to ask you, I know we haven't gotten to G's Bend, which is ridiculous because we're supposed to be talking about that. But I want to ask you... I'm kind of thinking I want to go back and do a graphic novel. Where was I? Right.
Yeah, that's terrific.
Totally.
So go on.
Yeah, so since we talked about the Jewish stuff, I'm curious because you also write for Jewish books about different aspects of being Jewish or the Holocaust and other things. And I'm curious, who are you writing for in those books? Like, are you writing for a general audience or mostly a Jewish kids, or sort of how do you place yourself in that part of the genre that you're writing in?
Oh, that's a wonderful question, because I never expected to be writing about Holocaust subjects, and I never expected to be writing about Judaica in any way. I'm first generation. My father came here from Russia when he was 9 years old. And he went through pogroms, and the way my dad would tell it, he was a great storyteller. It sounded so exciting. I thought, I missed all the excitement. It's so boring in the Bronx.
When did he come? When did
he came here in 1914.
1914.
And he grew up on the Lower East Side, and told me how he and his brothers slept on the fire escape. And I thought, gee, I missed all the fun.
Right, right.
And that my older brother remembered the Depression. He said, those were the good times. So I always felt I was so out of it, in the stable 40s and 50s.
Right.
But despite my father's great prejudice against me marrying the man of my choice, who was non-Jewish at Oberlin, he was absolutely bigoted. But we never belonged to a synagogue. And the one time I went to Sunday school, I asked the rabbi, who was very pretentious, about God, and he was very angry with me, so I left and walked home. And I was about 8 years old, and my mother nearly had a fit that I walked home all those streets through the Bronx, because he wouldn't answer my question. So I had no training and no schooling. There were no such things in those days of bat mitzvah and all that.
Yeah, right.
Nothing, except that my dad and grandmother spoke Yiddish, which was totally embarrassing to me, because sometimes I slept over at my grandma's when my parents went to the little cottage they had in Westport, Connecticut, that they finally had, in addition to our apartment in the Bronx. And I was a teenager. I didn't want to go. And they said, okay, I had to stay with my grandma. And she would make schnapps in her bathtub. And a boyfriend would pick me up, and I was so embarrassed because he'd say, do you mind if I use the bathroom before we go? And I thought, no. So I was embarrassed. You know, my grandma hardly spoke any English. So rather than being proud of my identity, you know, I just thought, oh, no. You know, just.
Right.
And there was a quota at Oberlin at the time I went to school. I entered Oberlin when I was 16, 1955. And there were only two of us, two New York Jews, and just a handful of Jewish kids from other places. And, you know, it was wonderful. I loved it. You know, I loved meeting so many different people. I adored it. I just adored it. But I never thought of myself as particularly Jewish, other than having the fun, you know, of hanging out with some of my friends, my one friend from New York. So then, along the way, when I was here in Los Angeles, and my dad would tell about the pogroms, and, you know, it was as if I had experienced it. He was such a good storyteller, but I never dreamed of writing about it or reading about it. In those days, they wanted to forget about it, you know, not talk about it.
Right.
And because of my background in art, along the way, I have a wonderful friend and mentor who wrote a marvelous book called Journey to America about her own experience sneaking out of Nazi Germany with her mother and sisters. And it's just about to have its 50th reunion,
Wow.
Sonia Levitin. And she was my dear friend and mentor in doing children's books. And she introduced me to her friend, who was the archivist at the Simon Wiesenthal Museum of Tolerance.
It's a great museum.
And oh, it's wonderful.
It's a great
and
museum.
Our friend Adair Klein knew that they had a collection of paintings by a woman named Friedel Dicker Brandeis. And she was looking for someone to write about this woman who, at a concentration camp called Terezin, or Theresienstadt, near Prague, had taught the children had guided the children into making art. And this incredible, I get shivers even talking about it. It's a warm day. She guided the children, and the artwork was miraculously saved.
That's amazing.
And Friedel and most of the children were murdered at Auschwitz. And Adair had asked my friend Sonia to write about it. And Sonia, whose grandmother had been imprisoned at Terezin, said, it's too close to home. You know, I can't do it.
Yeah.
So then they asked me, knowing of my background in art.
Right.
And I thought, how could I do this? You know, what do I know? I always feel like with Quilts of G's Ben, I'm just the conduit.
Right. Like, how can you...
I'm the conduit for this story that has to be told. Is there anybody else who's going to tell it? I don't think so.
Right.
So it's got to be me.
It's got to be you.
So Adair says, and you will go to Prague. I said, well, how can I do this without meeting some of these so-called children now in their 70s?
Right.
And getting permission. And she said, well, you will go to Prague. So I come home and say to my husband, and remember, we're now the parents of 6 children and looking after elderly parents of our own. I have to go to Prague. So he says, why? You know, it's like saying I got to go to the moon.
Right.
And I said, because Adair Klein told me to. He said, who's Adair?
Right.
I'm like an 8-year-old saying I got to do this field trip.
Right.
We went. Part of the deal was I had to talk him. He's in real estate, and he's wonderful. And he had this deal. It's such a funny story. He said, oh, if this deal happens, I'm going to take you to Paris. And I said, oh, yeah, sure, right. You know, like that's going to happen.
Right.
And it happened. So I said, instead of going to Paris,
right.
we could take a little trip to Prague and a side trip to this concentration camp.
Uh-huh.
So he looked at me like I lost my mind. And my dear friend Ann Whitford Paul, I keep referring to her because she and her husband had just been, and she's not Jewish, but her husband is. They had just been to Prague. And she said, come on over. I'll fix you this lovely dinner. We'll talk him into Prague being this romantic place that he has to take you to. So it happened. And Adair sent me some letters of introduction because, again, I felt I can't begin to do this without seeing the place.
Yeah.
Which was a leap because usually there's no budget, for these kinds of travels, in children's books.
Right.
But I did meet some of the children, and they said, yes, we want you to tell our story.
Oh,
yes,
so cool.
yes. And at that time, some of their diaries were being translated in Washington, D.C., and wouldn't you know, it's always serendipitous. I really believe in serendipity, that the woman translating these diaries, because I had to get her permission, was the daughter of good friends of some of my classmates at Oberlin. So we had mutual ties there, which kind of gave me my admission.
Yeah.
So that's how it came about. So here I am writing about this concentration camp near Prague and the art that came out of it, and I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it.
That's amazing.
And so it just doing that project. During that project, I became better acquainted with one of the children. Her name is Ella Weisberger, and she recently died. And I thought, I've got to know more about these particular girls, the 11-year-olds, my favorite age, in this particular room. How come so many of them survived? What was it about that room that helped so many of these kids survive?
Yeah.
So, it's always a question that leads you. And my wonderful editor at Holiday House, where I've done, quite a few books on social justice, was so great because we were signed up to do another book called There Goes the Neighborhood, a book on design at Holiday House. And when I found out about Terezin, I said to my editor, I can't stop thinking about it. I just can't stop. And she said, well, then don't.
So cool.
She said, why don't we do that book first? And it takes a really compassionate, it takes the right editor, to work with you on a project.
So amazing. And you published that book. That's The Cat with the
Published
Yellow Star.
That book. It's
right?
a classic. It's been in print since the year 2000, and it led to the next book, which led to some more books. And it led to some other topics that I did at Abrams. Because I began to get this label as a writer about Jewish subjects, one time at a book festival, I was there supposedly signing these books about Terezin. Well, hardly anybody came up. It was the wrong community for me to be doing this book. I mean, people weren't interested. But another woman who had people lined up out the door had done an ABC of pirates. And so she sees me sitting there by myself, with maybe two people wanting to know about my books. And she said, I'm going to give you a gift. She said, do you know that there was a Jewish pirate named Jean Lafitte? And I got that tingly feeling. I always get it, that tingly feeling. I said, what? There was a Jewish pirate? So I run home. I call my wonderful librarian friend at the Simon Wiesenthal. She looks up, the references, and sure enough, there were a lot of Jewish pirates. So I write to my editor at Abrams and say, guess what? I want to do this book. And to top everything off, he saved the War of 1812.
Yes, well, I know Jean Lafitte because I live in New Orleans. So our kids learn about that. And there's Jean Lafitte Park, and it's like a thing here. So
of course, you're New Orleans.
Right.
Oh, my goodness.
So that's so funny. I didn't know that about him. That's so funny.
So that was a thrill. And we were supposed to have the book out in time for the ALA, American Library Association, was supposed to meet in New Orleans the year that the book was supposed to come out. And, my agent and I were thinking of our outfits. And then wouldn't you know that the illustrator of the book, because the book was to be illustrated, his wife got terribly sick, and he couldn't come through with the finished art on time. So the pub date had to be postponed. But thank you so much. Of course, you're in New Orleans.
Yeah. I imagine it's a very popular book here.
I think so. And there's an organization called PJ Library, which an organization, PJ Ming Pajamas, that picks up titles that have been published that have strong Jewish themes.
Oh, interesting.
To republish under their own imprint. And of course, it's a win-win, for the author, for the original publisher, for everyone. And they picked up Jean Lafitte and a couple of my other titles, like the Bernstein book.
Right.
So thank you for asking,
of
because,
course.
and I'm currently doing an adult project. Oh, golly, I'm so moved by it. You should never talk about something before it really happens. But it's about Jewish artists in Paris and
cool.
at the beginning of the century. So somehow, my sense of Jewishness has developed over the years with this work. So thanks for asking such a good question.
Yeah. So let's turn, of course, because why we're officially here. By 45 minutes in, we're finally getting to why we're supposed to be chatting. But that's totally okay, because we get to do whatever we want.
It's my fault. I sidetracked.
It's totally my fault too, because you have so many cool things to talk about. Okay, so tell me about writing The Quilts of G's Bend, and sort of how did this happen, and what was the process with this book?
Well, this came about because I saw some of the quilts at the Whitney Museum.
You did.
I know that Laura Bickford, who I worked with during this project, mentioned the Whitney.
Yeah, but you saw it at the Whitney. You were one of
I saw these quilts.
Wow.
I was stunned because, I love art.
Yes,
Growing up in New York, I love these museums. At that time, serendipity again, I was doing a book for another publisher, a Crown, which is part of Random House, called Art Against the Odds, from slave quilts to prison paintings.
Wow, cool.
And my editor was just wonderful. Again, great editor who kept letting me choose my own subdivisions, for the book. We even included some of the art from Terezin. One of the children, had done a book with her own art. So I took my editor to dinner, just as a way to thank her, and, with a few friends. And I said to her, I just saw this amazing exhibit at the Whitney, Quilts of G's Bend. Do you think there's time for us to include some of these quilts in our section on slave quilts? And the word slave is no longer politically correct, but that's what we were using at the time. She said, sure. So we included a couple of the quilts. In fact, some that I included in my book, The Quilts of G's Bend. But I was so moved by, a video was being shown at the time showing the women actually quilting and singing and interviews. And I was just knocked out. The reviewers had said that this is eye-poppingly gorgeous.
Yeah.
This is modern art. And I looked at these, and I saw these quilts as art.
Yeah.
I wasn't thinking of them, because I'm not a quilter, as incredible pieces of social history. I just thought, wow, how did these designs happen? And when you look at a wonderful piece of art, you look, you turn away, and then you go back, and suddenly you see a color, a design, something you didn't notice the first time through. So I always thought about it. I'd love to do a book on just these quilts. And then fast forward a few years, I was giving a talk in, I think, Sacramento, through Society of Children's Book Writers. I forget what the subject was. But during the course of the talk, me, I sidetracked. I said, I've always wanted to do a book on the Quilts of G's Bend. I think somebody said, are there any subjects you haven't done?
Yeah.
And I mentioned it, and sitting in the front row is a woman who comes up to me after and said, and I said, but I wouldn't know how to get in touch with the quilters or who the permissions. And she comes up to me and says, I was married to Julian Cox, who was the curator of the High Museum in Atlanta.
Wow.
And he did a show of the quilts.
Uh-huh.
I can give you the phone numbers of Will Arnett and Bill Arnett, who put these quilts together for an exhibit. It was serendipity.
That's really cool.
So I wrote it all down, and I'm very messy, and I had piles and stacks of papers on my desk, and I stuck it somewhere. And then I had a 2-book contract with Abrams, and we couldn't come up with the subject for the second book. And I said to my editor, I'd love to do a book on the quilts of G's Bend. And he said, oh, okay, because the time was right.
Yeah.
Because 20 of the quilts were about to be given to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And he thought that's a good tie-in.
Yeah.
So the next step was to find that number. And I reached my hand in this pile of papers and extracted the handwritten note and called Daphne. And she put me in touch with Bill Arnett. And that's how this all got started.
It's very cool. It's so cool.
And I really saw the quilts as art.
Yeah.
And then I began to realize I sent for every single book. I'm looking at them here in my office. These huge coffee table books there are 3 of them on the quilts of G's Bend.
Right.
And so that's how I began my research.
I love it. It just tells the story in such a nice way.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful book, and it does give sort of the I don't know. So where did did you work with, how did you get the photographs? Like, how much were you involved with what was your process with this book?
Well, my process was choosing all the art for the book and the photos. I always do that. And my editors let me do that because the art tells the story.
The art tells the story.
And as you must know, with the incredible quilts of G's Bend, as Laura said, there are thousands of them. So how to choose? And here, these amazing quilts. So I tried to choose different, I definitely wanted to include a couple that would be in the collection, gifted to the Met, that would be in their permanent collection. I worked with Laura to determine which ones would be in that. But I also wanted to show examples of different kinds of quilts.
Yeah, it's great.
So I had some that were patterns, patterns that might have been used to help enslaved people find the way north. I wanted to show some of these stars. They were incredible.
Yeah,
I wanted to show these housetop quilts. And in fact, Bill Arnett over the phone said, you've got to see the quilt that is an imaginary vision of what the old plantation looked like.
So cool.
And I forgot which one he said, and just by luck I included it because it was one of the ones that was shown at the Met. And I wanted to show that the actual photo that Bill Arnett had seen in a book that led him to finding the woman who made this amazing quilt.
So very cool.
But I also wanted to show photos of the quilters.
Yeah.
I felt that was terribly important. Recent photos and older photos.
Yeah.
And then, again, serendipity. As I began doing the research, I found out that G's Bend played a part in the March to Selma, led by Dr. Martin Luther King.
Right.
And he stopped at Camden. He stopped, in G's Bend on his way to Camden.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, man, this...
Right, because you had written on that subject as well, right? So that's part of one of the things you've also been right. We haven't talked about it, but that's why, because it connected to the work you had done previously.
Right, and I thought it just really enriched the story.
Yeah.
Told more about the quilters and their experiences. And there's one quilt that I definitely knew I had to include where the quilter had included little strips with the word vote.
Yes, I like that one. That's so great, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And I kept thinking, I've got to find a photo of Dr. King, speaking that night. But I couldn't. But I spoke to the journalist who was there, who did a piece for the New York Times, and told me the story of how the ferry was shut down. The New York Times did a whole piece on this. When the women tried to follow Dr. King, quite a few of the quilters and their husbands, families, he said, come with me, we'll go. And they followed, and the next week the ferry was shut down. So I know that Laura mentioned how difficult it is to get to G's Bend, how it's quicker, to take the ferry. And that ferry was shut down for a long time.
Wow. And
that's a story in itself.
Well, I love it. I really do. The book is so great. And one of the questions I have, besides the fact that I now have to go read all of your books because I just want to read every single one of them, I'm going to the library after I was actually planning to go back to the library today, so I'm going to have to, those are going to be like, what are you doing? But I guess the last question I have for you, because I love the way that the book opens, and I thought I'd just read the first sentence, is talk to you about the beginning books. And like, I think that first sentence is so important to grab your audience, particularly your young audience. But I felt like I wanted to read the rest of the book because of the first sentence. So if you're cool, I wanted to read that first sentence before we chatted about openings. When Nettie Young was 11 years old, her mother gave her a pile of cloth strips and told her to make a quilt all by herself. I'll do one more. Nettie had always sat with her mother and watched her quilting, picking up the scraps at her feet, but this time her mother walked away. And I just thought, like, whoa, like, I want to read more, right? And I'm wondering about how important is that first sentence, that first, like, that almost like the hook to get the reader to keep reading.
You nailed it exactly, the hook, because it's a story.
Right.
And I feel that usually any good nonfiction book begins with a person, a character, and an action. And that's just it. I love mysteries. In fact, I did publish mysteries for kids. And I want there to be a cliffhanger, at the end of almost each sentence. What happened next? And I wanted to grab the attention of an 11 or 12-year-old reader with an individual story. And I thought I loved that story myself, of the many transcripts I read. I poured through these huge books that the Arnett's have published, with all the stories of the quilters.
Yeah.
But I thought, then what would you do?
Yeah.
What's the process of the quilter? And thank you so much for reading that aloud, because I'm so glad that works for you.
Yeah, it really did. Because you could
made
put yourself,
me want to read on.
Yeah, you could put yourself into that person, right? Of like being that kid. I don't know, it was just really great. Well, I imagine, you've done great things with your life. The stories you tell.
Thank you.
And the kids, and the impact I imagine you've had on so many kids' lives, and opening up worlds and letting them really understand what's happening. It's just really cool. It's really...
thank you so much.
Yeah.
Because when I listened to Laura's interview with you, which was wonderful, in fact, I learned some things I hadn't known before about the quilts. But she said to raise awareness. And I think that's something you always want to do with books like this.
Yeah.
Raise awareness.
Totally. I think the last question I have is, I'm wondering... It just keeps coming back to me, and I haven't asked this question, is oftentimes you deal with subjects that are difficult subjects. The Holocaust, civil rights, even someone cutting their ear off, right? And
yes.
How do you approach those kind of subjects when your audience is 11? And I'm wondering if you have to have thought about this, of you're kind of introducing things into the world that they may not know, that aren't always pleasant. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about that.
Oh, thank you for asking that, because those questions are very, very difficult and require a lot of thought. And for instance, with not only the ear cutting, I went round and round with my editor on that. And, he said, wait a minute, this is too graphic, And I said, so many kids know about this in a kind of jokey way. Right. They'll dress up like that for Halloween. And I think it's important to show it and also to do the follow-up, because he did recover. Yeah. And he and Gauguin corresponded as friends. When it comes to the Holocaust, I think, what do I want my own children to know about at that age?
Yeah.
I think about my own children and my grandchildren. What is truthful is very important, but what is also appropriate for that age.
Right. To
not frighten them, and yet to be honest, because I discussed those Holocaust books, my goodness, with my editor, Adair, who's a great-grandmother. We would discuss over and over, even the pictures, the photographs, which ones to include.
Yeah.
And it requires a lot of thought, and yet I want to be totally honest, but not brutally honest.
Right.
I don't want to frighten the children, and that's why I like to include a big bibliography for those kids who are more sophisticated or ready to move on.
I love that too. I think that, that's so important, because you're like, it's just, you're introducing them to something, and then if they do want more, that you're helping them to get there,
Exactly. But thank you for asking that, because those are soul-searching questions.
Yeah,
and
they are.
For one of the photos that we used in Fireflies in the Dark, oh my goodness, Adair, well, she's retired in Israel, so maybe she won't hear this, but very secretly, because she was a conscientious librarian, archivist, she allowed me to take a book home overnight called Lily's Handbook. It was discovered in an incredible scrapbook of photos that this woman had kept that she didn't even know she had next to her bedstand during one of the Red Cross missions in one of the hospitals when she was recovering after the liberation. And we looked through to find just the right photo that would suggest, where the children went, but not actually show it. And that took a lot of soul searching.
That's a lot. Yeah. That's a lot, because I feel like your audience is going to start to identify with the artists and the people, and then it just got to be really brutal. You know what I mean? Like you're saying, like, they're your age, this has happened to them. That's just really hard. And I know it's important and it's good, but to be the bearer of that news and to explain that is just a lot. It's a very heroic thing that you're doing, and your writing matters a lot.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, because, sometimes I wonder, I so appreciate your interest, and you're doing this interview, because I sit here and I work usually about every day of the week, because these projects are all consuming, and it takes so much time that is stimulating, to do the research and then the writing. And sometimes you don't know, you get reviews, but you don't know, are there really people out there
who
care? So thank you. So
of course, I get that.
Where are they?
Right, exactly. Well, you are just such a delight, and I'm just thank you so much for spending this time with me. And the book is awesome, and we have a lot of people with kids and grandkids out there, so maybe they'll learn about you, or they already know about you, and I can't wait. I can't wait to go check out more books and read more. So
thank you. I so appreciate your interest, and thank you for giving me the chance to think about all this and review my notes and listen to your podcast. They're wonderful. How do I get to hear more? What do I do?
So I will send you a link. It's on iTunes and everywhere else. So if you just put in Just Want to Quilt into a podcast, you'll see them. What we'll do next is we'll edit. We won't really edit. We'll just put some music on, and I'll listen to it and make sure the sound is okay. And we'll send you a link to it, so you'll have it once it's ready to go.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gard. Really,
awesome.
Thank you.
No problem. Hold on. Let me turn off the recording, and hold on just a sec. So you've been listening to Just Want to Quilt, a research podcast coming out of Tulane University Law School. And I'm Elizabeth Townsend Gard. If you like this podcast, keep listening. Also, we have a Facebook group. Come join us. We talk about a lot of things. We also have an Instagram account. And of course, most importantly, I really hope you get a chance to quilt today.